The driveway glistened under the silvery moonlight as Michael pulled in, his car's tires crunching against the gravel. Home after a grueling 6-week business trip, he expected warm embraces and laughter. Instead, the house was eerily quiet. The porch light flickered. Vanessa had always been meticulous about maintenance. This felt neglected. His chest tightened. Inside, the ambiance was colder than the November air. The living room, always a cozy family sanctuary, now felt sterile. Michael's eyes darted to the family portraits on the walls. His absence should have left gaps in their lives, but it was as though he'd been erased. His children, Emily and Jake, emerged from the den. Their greetings were stiff and perfunctory. Emily mumbled something about homework, her gaze fixed on the floor. Jake, who used to light up at Michael's return, barely grunted before vanishing upstairs. Michael turned towards the kitchen. Vanessa stood by the island, wineglass in hand, her smile taut. She wasn't alone. The sight of Andrew's car in the driveway clicked into place as Michael spotted his younger brother sitting at the counter, too at ease. Michael's greeting was met with evasive responses. A whispered argument in the study later confirmed his worst fears. Vanessa and Andrew were entangled in more than shared drinks. Their words sliced through the walls, plotting not only betrayal, but the theft of everything Michael had built. Michael clenched his fists, retreating silently. The echoes of deceit marked the beginning of his calculated vengeance. Michael retreated to the guest house, the small structure nestled at the edge of the sprawling backyard. Once his retreat for moments of solitude, it now served as a refuge for piecing together the shattered fragments of his life. He paced the modest space, every whispered phrase from the house replaying in his head. Andrew's sly tone, Vanessa's manipulative certainty. Every syllable stoked his fury. Yet anger could wait. He needed clarity. His mind catalogued the changes he had ignored in recent months. Vanessa's newfound obsession with business management, always framed as wanting to help with his empire. The subtle way Andrew had inserted himself into Michael's personal affairs, under the guise of being a supportive sibling. Even Emily and Jake's abrupt shifts in demeanor. Pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized existed were falling into place. The next morning, he feigned normalcy at breakfast. Vanessa moved through the kitchen with feigned cheerfulness, the perfect picture of a loving wife. Andrew had conveniently left before sunrise, his coffee mug conspicuously washed and placed back on the rack. The children were subdued, Emily distractedly scrolling through her phone, while Jake buried himself in a cereal box. Michael watched them all, his gaze piercing but unreadable. "Long trip, Dad?" Jake muttered without meeting his eyes. Michael forced a smile. "It always is. What have you two been up to?" Their replies were vague, almost rehearsed. A basketball game, a sleepover. Neither mentioned any interaction with Andrew, though Michael knew better. Vanessa chimed in with a cheerful, "They've been wonderful, haven't they? Keeping busy while you've been working so hard." Her tone was saccharine, her touch on his arm practiced. Michael suppressed the urge to puss in front of her. That afternoon, Michael started combing through his office files, the ones Vanessa had insisted she reorganize months ago, offering to streamline the estate plans and investment records. At first glance, everything appeared pristine. Too pristine. The documents were neatly tabulated, but something about them felt off. He opened his laptop and logged into his personal accounts. Passwords Vanessa should not have known were suddenly invalid. His secondary accounts, meant for emergencies, flagged recent transactions he hadn't authorized. Minor amounts transferred into an account under a name he didn't recognize. Determined, Michael hired a private investigator, a man who specialized in uncovering personal and financial betrayals. The investigator, a discreet yet tenacious individual named Carl, promised to report back within 48 hours. The following day, Michael returned from a client meeting to find Andrew's car parked outside again. This time, it wasn't parked in its usual discreet spot, but boldly by the front door. Michael strode inside and heard laughter from the living room. Andrew lounged on the sofa, Emily beside him, both staring at a video on Andrew's phone. Jake wandered in moments later, holding a basketball, offering Andrew a high five. "Michael," Vanessa greeted from the dining room, her voice falsely bright. "You're home early." Michael didn't reply. He caught Andrew's smirk, but the barely concealed disdain behind Vanessa's words, and felt his blood turn to ice. That night, Michael sat in his study. The evidence was mounting, each discovery confirming that Vanessa and Andrew's betrayal ran deeper than an affair. They weren't just taking his family. They were coming for everything he'd worked for. Michael sat in the dimly lit guest house, the flickering light of his laptop illuminating the mounting evidence before him. Carl, the private investigator, had delivered his first report, and it was worse than Michael had anticipated. Bank transfers linked to Andrew's account, false signatures on financial documents, and the most damning revelation, a forged power of attorney form granting Vanessa access to all his holdings. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a hostile takeover. His heart twisted as Carl described the scheme in detail during their late-night phone call. "Your wife and brother have been positioning themselves for months, maybe longer. The small transfers from your accounts. They've been pooling into an offshore account under a corporate shell tied to Andrew. Vanessa's been leveraging your assets as collateral for a loan through a separate company. It's all connected to your latest expansion project." Michael's breath caught. The expansion project was his crowning achievement, a sprawling tech hub designed to transform the city's economy. If what Carl suggested was true, Vanessa and Andrew weren't just stealing from him, they were sabotaging his legacy. He closed his eyes, the weight of it all threatening to crush him. His children were unwitting pawns in this charade, manipulated by Vanessa and Andrew to mistrust him. The growing distance between him and Emily and Jake wasn't coincidental. It was engineered. Carl confirmed it with intercepted messages from Vanessa to Andrew. "Keep reinforcing that Michael doesn't care about them. He's always working. Let them see you as the father figure." The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just taking his wealth, they were taking his family. The next morning, Michael maintained his facade of normalcy, but every interaction was laced with suspicion. Over breakfast, Vanessa gushed about the expansion project, her voice dripping with faux enthusiasm. "It's such a bold move, Michael. Everyone's talking about it." He noticed her subtle glances at Jake, who nodded with muted disinterest. Emily sat scrolling on her phone, disengaged as usual. Michael sipped his coffee, masking the storm brewing inside. Later that day, he searched his office and unearthed a hidden drawer Vanessa didn't know about. Inside were older financial records she hadn't tampered with, providing a stark contrast to the recent manipulated documents. Using these, he began to map out the discrepancies. Money funneled, property titles altered, and mysterious investments tied back to Andrew's name. A growing rage simmered beneath his calm exterior. He spent the evening documenting everything. Each lie, each forgery, every whisper of deceit became a weapon in his arsenal. This wasn't a simple betrayal. It was an orchestrated destruction of his life. By the end of the night, Michael had formulated the beginnings of his counterattack. He wouldn't confront them yet, not until he was ready to dismantle their scheme piece by piece. As he stared at the evidence one last time, a thought solidified in his mind. Vanessa and Andrew had underestimated him. They had played their hand too soon. And Michael Shaw was a man who thrived under pressure. Michael knew confrontation wouldn't serve his purpose yet. He needed to dismantle Vanessa and Andrew's plans from within, quietly, surgically. To outplay his adversaries, he had to think like them. That night, he began setting the stage for their downfall, leveraging every resource at his disposal. First, he met with Carl in person. The investigator, meticulous as ever, handed Michael a second, more detailed dossier. "Your brother is overconfident," Carl said, sliding photos across the table. "Here he is at a private club, meeting with a banker tied to your company's creditors. And this," he pointed to a grainy image of Vanessa and Andrew, sitting in a corner booth, "is them drafting their playbook. They're moving fast, Michael." Michael studied the images, his face unreadable. "Not fast enough," he murmured. With the evidence in hand, Michael contacted his legal team. He was deliberate, consulting only his most trusted lawyer, Elena Rivers. Over a tense lunch in a secluded restaurant, he presented her with the files. "I want to quietly shift my assets," he said, his voice steady but charged with resolve. "The offshore accounts, my holdings in the tech hub, everything. Make it look routine, but I want full control moved out of their reach." Elena frowned. "This will take time and finesse, Michael. If they're watching, any misstep could tip them off." "Then make it flawless," Michael replied. "And, Elena, prepare for a worst-case scenario. I want my children protected. A trust fund, secured under conditions only I can modify." That evening, Michael returned home to find Vanessa in the study, flipping through papers with feigned interest. She looked up, her smile sharp. "You've been working late again. The kids missed you at dinner." Michael forced a smile. "Important deals take time, but I'll make it up to 'em." Her eyes narrowed slightly, searching for any crack in his facade, but Michael offered none. Instead, he casually placed a folder on the desk. "Speaking of deals, I need you to look over these proposals tomorrow. They're for the expansion project." Vanessa hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." The folder was bait, carefully crafted with innocuous documents alongside subtle markers to track if she or Andrew tampered with them. Michael watched her as she slid it into her bag, mentally cataloguing every move. The next phase of his plan involved Emily and Jake. He began engaging them in small but meaningful ways, helping Jake with his basketball drills and asking Emily for advice on one of his projects. At first they were reluctant, but over time, Michael noticed a shift. Their walls, erected by Vanessa and Andrew's manipulation, began to crack. In private, Michael planted seeds of doubt in their minds without ever disparaging Vanessa or Andrew. When Jake mentioned an offhand comment from Andrew about Michael's obsession with work, Michael countered subtly, "I work for us, Jake. For you and Emily. Everything I've built is for this family." As days passed, Vanessa's confidence grew, and Andrew became more brazen. Neither noticed the subtle changes in the dynamics of the house. Michael was setting the trap, one careful move at a time, and they were walking straight into it. Michael sat in his study, the early morning sun creeping through the blinds as he finalized the final pieces of his counterattack. Weeks of meticulous preparation had brought him to this moment. He had allowed Vanessa and Andrew to believe they were winning, feeding their arrogance while systematically dismantling their plan. Every move they made now unfolded in his favor. The evening confrontation was carefully choreographed. Vanessa had insisted on hosting a dinner party, ostensibly to celebrate the progress of Michael's tech expansion. Andrew, of course, was invited, and Michael knew the guests would be a smokescreen for their final push to consolidate control. Before the guests arrived, Michael executed his coup de grace. Earlier that day, Elena had filed motions to freeze all accounts associated with the fraudulent transfers Vanessa and Andrew had orchestrated. The offshore accounts were inaccessible, and the legal ownership of key assets reverted entirely to Michael. Its tech hub project was placed under a new holding company, its ownership locked tight under his name. As the house filled with laughter and clinking glasses, Michael moved like a man without a care, greeting guests and fielding questions about his latest ventures. Vanessa, radiant and poised, played the perfect hostess, her confidence palpable. Andrew lingered nearby, smug and assured, offering congratulations to Michael with barely concealed condescension. It was during the dinner toast that Michael struck. Rising from his chair, he held up a glass of champagne, commanding the room's attention. "To family," he began, his tone warm yet deliberate. "The cornerstone of everything I've achieved. The support, the trust. It's irreplaceable." His eyes flicked briefly to Vanessa and Andrew, their expressions faltering ever so slightly. He continued, voice hardening, "But sometimes trust is misplaced. Sometimes those closest to us are the ones who plot against us." Gasps rippled through the room as Michael gestured toward the study. "Andrew, Vanessa, would you join me?" The murmurs among the guests swelled as the two stood, their faces pale but trying to maintain composure. Inside the study, Michael locked the door and turned, his expression colder than they had ever seen. "You've underestimated me," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut. "The accounts are frozen, the holdings untouchable. Every step you took, every lie, every theft. I was watching." Vanessa's mask cracked. "Michael, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted. "I understand that you both wanted to destroy everything I built. And for what? Greed? Jealousy?" Andrew's bravado crumbled under Michael's glare. "You can't prove." Michael placed the documents on the desk. Financial records, surveillance photos, copies of forged signatures. "These are going to the authorities. By the time I'm done, you'll be bankrupt, disgraced, and facing charges for fraud." Vanessa's voice turned desperate. "The children. Michael, don't do this to them." Michael's expression softened momentarily. "The children deserve the truth, and unlike you, I'll give it to them." By the next morning, the fallout had begun. Vanessa and Andrew's schemes unraveled publicly, their reputations shredded. Michael, though bruised by the betrayal, emerged resolute. He gathered Emily and Jake, explaining the truth carefully and honestly. In the end, he walked away, not broken, but stronger, his empire intact, his children beginning to see him in a new light. Michael left the ashes of Vanessa and Andrew's betrayal behind, ready to rebuild on his terms.